We're going to look at Daniel chapter 1 this morning, and you can find that in the blue Bibles in the seat pocket in front of you. It is in the Old Testament. Daniel is a prophet in the Old Testament. Very unique. But as you're finding that, we talked about how we are influenced by the things around us. It is amazing what shapes young minds. What is shaping young minds in our world? There is a book by a lady named Jean Twenge is her name, the author of iGen. Some people have called it Generation Z. She calls it iGen because those who've born between 1995 and 2012, which I have 3 of those of my children, are really the first generation in that in 2011, basically, children grew up with a cell phone in their hand, right? And she looks at what are the impacts and what is the influence of growing up in the I generation. So here are some characteristics that I want to put up on the screen of the I generation. The I gen, those born between 95 and 2012, spend 6 hours a day on their phones. They spend another hour and a half watching television. That's a full day's work, right? That's a full day's work. That's amazing. That's between school and sleep and chores and all the other things that are in life, 7.5 hours spent on a digital screen. iGeneration are growing up slower, Jean says. Dr. Twenge says in her book that they actually do more with their parents. They get their license later in life. In other words, used to be, when I grew up, man, you hit 16, you had your license, you had your permit 2 years before that, and you were driving even then. And now kids sometimes wait until much later to get their license. So they end up doing more with their parents and spending more time with their parents. They don't get jobs as early in life as the generations before them. So some of the markers that would indicate adulthood are coming later in life for the I generation. There is a dramatic drop in reading. The iGen don't read books the way the generations before them did, which you can imagine if you're spending 7.5 hours on a digital screen, you don't read books. And the unfortunate thing that Dr. Twenge found is that that's caused a dramatic drop in the SAT scores, especially on critical reading and writing, that those scores are dropping because of it. Next thing is seeing a dramatic rise in depression. Self-mutilation, suicide, those kinds of things. They're seeing disturbing trends in this generation of those kinds of things. The I generation, last thing, is more likely to be raised by religiously unaffiliated parents than any generation in our history as a country before. That they're more likely to grow up in a family that is unaffiliated with any religious connection. And so those are some of the influences. And it is so easy in our world to just move through time and often without thinking about the wind and the waves that shape our lives. We just move through time and we don't even think about the wind and the waves that shape our lives, right? We just kind of move through time. And sometimes historians can look back and say, oh, these were the things that shaped the boomer generation or whatever generation we're a part of. And they see those things more clearly, but we don't always see them. And in the book of Daniel, God had been warning the people for a long, long time. He said, you are wandering far from what I've called you to be as my people. You are allowing the influences around you and the temptations around you and the nations around you to influence who you are as my people. And this is not good. Here are some of the things that they were wandering from. They rebelled and refused God's plans for their lives. They ignored Sabbath rest. They ignored the plight of the poor. We talked about that a few weeks ago, about what God teaches us about caring for the poor. They ignored worship and pursued self-interest over praising God. They put greed, their own pleasure, pride, success, and told God he could go fly a kite. not in those actual words, but that's kind of the essence of what the people of Israel did. Listen to this one. They supported kings and leaders not because of their integrity and character, but because of the success that they would bring them. Not because of their integrity and character. They supported and followed kings, not because they were of good character, but because of what they thought they could bring them, the success they thought they could bring. The stench of their evil was starting to grow. They were seduced by the influences and the temptations of the cultures around them. They let the wind and the waves of influence wash over them, and they just went with the flow. They didn't fight those things that God said to fight. They just kind of went with the flow of whatever it was. So let's look at Daniel chapter 1. This is the story, the first chapter we're going to read this morning. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So here are the consequences. For God's people wandering from him, this is the result. And the Lord delivered. We're going to talk about that. That's a key phrase there. It wasn't just something that happened to them. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Along with some of the articles from the temple of God, these he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years. And after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, he gave the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants. Give us 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for just 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief officials presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus, the next king to come. Now I want to just give us a quick overview to give us some perspective on the book of Daniel. Before we dive into the first chapter, I want to look at Daniel just a little bit as a whole. So one of the characteristics is that this is the first time that God's people find themselves in exile in this particular generation and in this way. They've been to the promised land, and now they've been taken into exile. And as many conquering kingdoms do, and if you've studied history at all, you've heard of colonialism and what colonialism does and how it tries to basically reshape the cultures that it conquers. You learn they have to speak the language, you have to learn the religion, and these things are pushed on the conquered nations. And that's what happens here in Daniel, is that they're conquered by Babylonia, and so that culture is being pushed on them. It's being forced on them, and we see that. And we see it in the ways that things influence us. We see it in the food we eat, the worship that we do, the people that we hang out with, the education that we have. All of those things shape who we are as people. And so Nebuchadnezzar orders that the people who have been conquered are going to go through a 3-year indoctrination plan. And part of the challenge for Daniel and his friends and for all of God's people in a culture that is influencing them in one direction is to learn how to swim up the cultural stream. What are the places and what are the things that when culture tries to shape us, we want to hold on to God and say, no, I want God to shape me in this. I don't want to just go with the flow. Now, another interesting thing about the book of Daniel is that the word Yahweh, and that's the covenant name for God in the Old Testament. And it's used a lot in the Old Testament, but it's only used in one chapter in Daniel, and that's chapter 9. And if you have an NIV Bible, you always know when the word Yahweh is used because it's Lord in all capital letters. So if you're really curious, you want to turn to chapter 9 and you want to find the word Lord in all capital letters. Those are the places where the word Yahweh is used. And all throughout the rest of the book of Daniel, God is the God of the heavens, mighty God, most high God. And there's a clue here that God is not just God of the Israelites, He's God of all people and all nations. He is over all things. And so Daniel is a book that is especially geared to communicate not just to the people of Israel, but to all people, to us. Next thing is that it is a turning point in the history of the people of Israel. Daniel is a key turning point because it helps the people understand how do we live in exile. They're separated from their land, their king, and their temple. Everything that shaped who they were as God's people, those things are gone. Now, how do we live as God's people? Another interesting thing about the book of Daniel is the second half of the book is all prophetic visions. The first half is kind of a history, so scholars don't really know how to categorize the book of Daniel because a lot of times you get a book of prophecy, it's just all prophecy. And there's a little bit of narrative, a little bit of history in there. But Daniel is like the first half is like a historical book, and the second half is like prophecy. And I love this because in a unique way, God gives us a peek behind the curtain, the cosmic curtain. So we know from reading Scripture that there is a battle going on in our world that we can't see with our eyes. Right? There are principalities and powers, God says in the New Testament, that are doing battle as we make choices and as we serve Him in this life, in the world that we can see. But behind that, there is a spiritual battle going on. And in Daniel, we see this. We see the challenges that Daniel and his friends face in a foreign nation. And then in the second half, we peek behind the curtain and we see the power of God revealed as nations rise and fall, that God is ultimately in control of everything that happens. And the last thing I want us to notice about the overview of Daniel is that Daniel makes a very huge point at the end of the book. He reveals that the glorious kingdom that is to come, this cosmic peek behind the curtain, says God's kingdom is coming in a powerful way, but it all hinges on the appearance of a person. Daniel calls that person one like the Son of Man, and he is pointing to the person of Jesus Christ. And we're going to come back to that before we finish. So that's kind of an overview. But now as we look at the first chapter of Daniel, the translation doesn't help us, but in the Hebrew there are 3 key phrases. In the beginning you saw how it said God delivered. That phrase is actually in the Hebrew God gave. God gave Jehoiakim. And then there's another statement where it says that God gave or allowed Daniel to have favor in the eyes. That is the same phrase. God gave Daniel favor in the eyes of the guy who was in charge of his schooling. And then again, God gave Daniel and his friends to look better than any other, right? They were 10 times better looking and 10 times smarter than anybody else that went through the same school. In fact, better than any of the magicians, enchanters, and knowledgeable people in the whole kingdom. So there are 3 times that I want us to notice God gave, God gave, God gave. And the first time is that God gave Jehoiakim, who was the king at the time of God's people, he's the one who gave Jehoiakim to the foreign nation to be conquered. Now, in that culture and in that time, if a nation was conquered, it was assumed that the nation's God was conquered too. So the assumption here for a lot of people is that they just reading without thinking about this is that, okay, Israel's conquered, then Israel's God is conquered. But Daniel makes a clear point of saying, no, God is in control. God is not defeated. God is in control. He's the one who gave the king into foreign hands. And there's a little phrase here too. It isn't translated the right way in the NIV, but it's actually that they gave them and the temple vessels, because that's important too. So the temple, the worship of God, is also taken away and delivered into enemy hands, and it goes to the plain of Shinar. You don't see that here in this text, but it's that those things are given to the plains of Shinar. Now, what does that mean, the plains of Shinar? Well, in Genesis chapter 11, many, many years before this, there's the story of the Tower of Babel. And that's connected to the kingdom of Babylon. And in the story of the Tower of Babel, people tried to build a tower. And that was not uncommon in that time because everybody built ziggurats, these towers with steps, so that the gods could come and go from heaven to earth. But the people in Babel tried to build a tower so that they could be at the same level or above God. And if you know the story in Genesis chapter 11, God came down and there was judgment. And He separated the people by language. He confused their language. Not because He was worried that they would build a tower too big, but because He saw what they did together to do evil. Their pride overtook them. And so He humbled them in that way. And there's a clue here for King Jehoiakim and the people of Israel that it's time for the people to be humbled again. And that God's in control of that. And He's not out of control, and He hasn't missed that Israel's pride is going to be put in its place again. Okay, second, God gave. God gave favor to Daniel and his friends. Now, Daniel and his friends are in this school of indoctrination, right? And they are trying to indoctrinate them, to reshape who they are, so much so that they even change their names. They give them Babylonian names. They're teaching them the language of Acadia, the educational language of that time. They're dictating what they eat. They're dictating who they spend their time with. And it's interesting as Daniel and his friends find themselves out without anything that they had before, without their land, without their temple, without, everything that made them who they are as God's people. That's been ripped away from them. And they have to figure out how to be God's people in the midst of all of this foreignness. They find themselves in exile. I don't know if you've ever been in that place where you feel like God's just taking you off at the knees. He's pulled everything away from you that you hold dear and that's important to you. And you try to figure out, God, why? And so often, I know for me, when I get in those places, I use those things, those circumstances in my life that are so painful as an excuse to do the wrong thing. And Daniel and his friends had that opportunity. They could have said, you know what? God's forsaken us. We don't have our promised land. We don't have our temple. We don't have our king. We don't have any of the things that God has used to identify who we are. They could have just said, forget it. We're just going to go with the flow. We're just going to survive. And Daniel and his friends reached a point in their school of indoctrination where Daniel comes to the fore. He steps up as the leader and he says, we're not going to eat the food. And he goes to the leader and he says, give us different food. Here's what I want us to eat. And Ashpenaz says, I'll lose my head. I'm not going to do that. But Daniel doesn't stop. He doesn't just stop with the guy in charge. He goes to the guard who actually delivers the food and says, will you please, all we want is vegetables and water. We just want vegetables and water. Give us that and see what God does. Give it 10 days and see what God does. And it's amazing to me that in all this stuff that's coming at him, for some reason, Daniel and his friends choose the food as the place they draw the line. Because I think they knew that to sit at the king's table, to eat from the king's buffet, was the final straw for them, that they would just be succumbed into the culture. They would just be washed away by the wind and the waves of the culture around them. And they said, no. We will risk our lives. We will take whatever penalty is coming, but we won't do that. And it's interesting, people throughout the years, and some scholars get caught up in the diet. They say, well, if that's what Daniel ate, we should only eat vegetables and water. Right? And it's not about the diet. It's not about the diet. It's about Daniel and his friends fasting before God, saying, we want to eat in a way that honors God. We want to depend on God. We know that if we eat all this other stuff, we'll probably go strong and we'll probably be healthy, but we don't want to get our sustenance from this food. We want to get it from God. You follow me? So don't think it's just about the diet. I mean, you can eat vegetables and water if you want. More power to you. But it's not about the diet. There's also, anybody ever heard of Ezekiel bread? We used to have some in our freezer. Ezekiel bread, because in Ezekiel it talks about a certain kind of bread and the way it's supposed to be made. But the part they leave out is that God actually told Ezekiel to cook that bread over human dung. Ezekiel convinced God, please just let me cook it over animal dung. But I don't think any of the Ezekiel bread that we have in our freezers or that you've ever eaten was cooked over dung, right? It's not about the diet. That's not the point. The point is dependence on God. And that's what Daniel and his friends wanted to do. They wanted to be dependent on God, and this was the way. This was the place they drew the line. And they said, we're going to be dependent on God in this. And lo and behold, when it's all said and done, and they eat what God calls them to eat, and they find the right way to do the right thing. And that's really the definition of wisdom. Daniel and his friends found the right way to do the right thing. Because so often we get consumed with doing the right thing that we don't always think about the right way to do the right thing. And then we come off as self-righteous, or we come off in the wrong way. And Daniel's friends found the right way to do the right thing. And then God gave again. So God gave the king. He put them into exile. And then God gave them favor with the guy in charge. And finally, God gave them, literally, in the Hebrew, it says, fatter flesh. They looked better. When they were done eating what God had guided them to eat, when they were done fasting for Him in the way that He wanted them to, they looked better. And it was so clear to everybody that they looked better. Now, it was not just about vegetables and water that made them look so much better. It was about God giving, right? It was about God's favor that made them look so much better. It was clear again and again throughout the story that God is in control. He's the one orchestrating this. God gave fatter flesh. Now, the reason the text uses the phrase fatter flesh is because it is the same phrase that is used in the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph, one of the patriarchs. Earlier on in the history of Israel, there's a story of Joseph and how Joseph was sold as a slave by his brothers who hated him, and that Joseph, much like Daniel, finds himself in exile. And Joseph has to figure out how to live in exile. And God ties these two stories together of Daniel and Joseph because He wants the people to remember, you've been here before. This is not the first time that you as a people have experienced exile. Because if they remember Joseph, they remember why they were in exile, why they were slaves in Egypt. Because Joseph is the one who brought them to Egypt. And they ended up as slaves there. So God's reminding them when He says God gave them fatter flesh, and they think about Joseph, they think, oh, we've been here before. And I don't know about you, but every time I experience difficulty in life, I think, why am I here? Why did this happen? When I hear people in the church lament, why are we losing influence in our country? Why do we no longer live in a Christian country? Why is there not prayer in the public schools? And why is there not this? And why is the church diminishing in our country? God says, you've been here before. It shouldn't surprise you. And I am not out of control. This does not surprise God, and it should not surprise us. That when we experience pain, whether it's in our country or in our personal lives, when we go through difficult times, there's a part of us that should read things like Daniel and say, we've been here before. And God's not out of control. And God hasn't left us here. There might be pain and there might be difficulty in our circumstances, but God is still with us. And Daniel still saw it. Even though he was in exile, Daniel still saw it. He still saw God's presence. And he was wailing maybe at times, right? But in spite of the wailing, he knew God's presence, and he knew that God was still with him. God is not absent from Daniel's exile. Do you know that there are, right now in our world, 44 million people who are forcibly displaced because of war in their country, because of persecution? All over the globe, there are refugees who have no place to call home. 44 million people. That's a lot of people who are suffering in exile somewhere in our world. In some ways, I think God's saying it's not only something that He does with His people, it's part of the human condition. Part of the human condition is that we experience exile. How do we understand God's presence in the midst of exile? How do we understand what God is up to in the midst of exile? That's part of what the book of Daniel is teaching his people. God gave, God gave, God gave. Even in the midst of exile, God gave. We get uncomfortable when we're away from home for a couple weeks, right? I do. I travel in other countries over the years a couple of times, and it's like, I miss home after a little while. I just miss the food, I miss my language, I miss all of those things. Can you imagine spending the rest of your life in exile? How do we find God in the midst of exile? I want to close with this. Victory from defeat. It would appear at the outset that God is defeated. And there are other times throughout biblical history when we see that in his individual leaders. Jacob spent his share of time in exile in the Old Testament. Moses, one of the greatest leaders of all time, spent a great deal of time in exile in the wilderness, waiting. His own people spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. So there's this recurring theme, and it seems like God's defeated because His people are defeated. And it all points us to the story of what would seem to be the greatest defeat that God ever experienced, of Christ on the cross. That if God ever seemed to be defeated, it is when His Son, Jesus Christ, hung on the cross. And the finality of death And the silence of Saturday gave way to the rumbling victory of Sunday morning, when Jesus rose from the dead. And we live in a world where resurrection has happened. Amen? We live in a world where resurrection has happened, where it may seem that exile has overcome everything. But God is not surprised. God is not taken off guard. We are, but God is not. He is still in control. God gives. God gives. God gives. He is always in control. And not only does He give, but He gives us the most incredible motivation to be obedient to Him. Because ultimately, that's what Daniel and his friends choose to do. They find that place in the midst of all the influences around them, trying to reshape them, to reform who they are, and forget about being God's children, that they find the place of obedience in all that. And we're going to see more of that as we go through the story. But I don't want you to leave today saying, man, and all the influences that are around me in this world, I have to figure out how to be God's child in the midst of all. I have to pull myself up by my bootstraps and figure out how to do better at being obedient to God, because that's not the end of the story. Because the whole book of Daniel points us to the person of Jesus Christ. His sacrifice, God's victory through the defeat of Jesus Christ on the cross, because He knows the only way we have the power to be obedient is through the grace that He gives us. It is in the grace of Jesus Christ that we find the way to swim up the cultural stream. How to figure out what's the right way to do the right thing in a culture that is trying to shape us every single day. I mean, you know this, right? That culture is constantly trying to shape us. And ultimately, it is only through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, His grace in us, that gives us the power to figure out how to do the right thing in the right way. This song that the team's going to sing right now, I want you to pay special attention to this line. Because the chorus says, it is through His unfailing love that we will not be broken. I don't want you to just leave singing, we will not be broken, we will not be broken, because that's a great part of the chorus, and I want you to sing it, but I want you to sing the part that comes before it. It is through His unfailing love that we will not be broken. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thanks so much for the grace that You give us through Your Son, Jesus Christ. Lord, open our eyes to the forces all around us that are trying to shape how we think and how we feel and who we are as people. Open our eyes to see that the things that are trying to shape us are bringing us to a very dark place. A place of emptiness with no hope. But that You want to bring us to a very different place. You want to bring us into Your kingdom, to the kingdom where a resurrection has happened and marks everything about Your kingdom. Lord, it is through Your unfailing love that we will not be shaken. Amen.